All right, we're going to be continuing the Bible in a Year put forward by the Charles Stanley Life Principles Daily Bible, where we read little of the Old Testament, Psalm, Proverb, New Testament each day. In the Old Testament today, we're continuing in the plagues of Egypt. So we're in Exodus 9 and 10. And then in Matthew, it's the parable of the workers, which I will admit, when I first read it, which was probably sometime around this time last year, I I didn't think it was fair, and I think I understand it a bit better now, which shows maybe some of the learning and the growth that I've done over this last year, but still lots to learn. So maybe we'll all learn something together as we read tonight. Although no one watches these videos, so might just be me. So let's get into Exodus 9. And with this, it is the fifth plague. So let's just do a quick recap of what the other plagues have been. So the first plague was water turned to blood. Well, that's where the whole Nile turns to blood. First off, right off the bat, God is showing that he's more powerful than the gods of Egypt because they believe their water god or the god of the Nile was one of their strongest gods. And he just says, yeah, I'm the ruler here. And then we had the second plague, which was frogs. I thought this one was very random. I was thinking, why frogs? That seems weird. But then I read one of the little comments in the study Bible, and it said that frogs were the Egyptian god of fertility. So then now they're everywhere and they're disgusted by them. So once again, it's God saying, yeah, I'm more powerful than your fertility god here. And then they have gnats. This is the first time that the Egyptian magicians aren't able to duplicate what God has done. So the other times Pharaoh might have thought it was some sort of trick because his magicians were able to duplicate it. But on this one, they just say, hey, this is the finger of God. And then after that, the magicians aren't able to duplicate another one of the plagues that God has. And the fourth one is flies. And then we get into the fifth one, which is in Exodus 9, which is where we're picking up today. And this is Egyptian livestock die. So thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock that are in the field, horses, donkeys, camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die. And then to go even further, so this is where we are seeing the distinction made between the Egyptians and the people of Israel, even further showing that it's God's hand in these plagues, that he's able to separate it between the two, and that he's here to try to get the Hebrews out of Egypt. And then he even calls his shot, basically. He says exactly when it's going to happen. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And the next day the Lord did this thing. So he says the time, and it happens. All the livestock of the Egyptian died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. So Pharaoh sends out some scouts. Did this actually happen? Are none of theirs dead and all of ours dead? And what do you know? It's exactly as God said it would play out. So you might think Pharaoh would think, okay, he just wiped out all of our livestock. We had all this wealth after Joseph helped us build it up. Remember, because they stored up all the food during that famine, people sold all their livestock in order to get food. And now livestock seems like they're pretty much wiped out because Pharaoh continues to have a hard heart, continues to think that he can be on some equal playing field with God, that he has any say over God and any power over God's people. And his heart just continues to be hardened. So even in this case where it's pretty clear that God's in control and he could do much worse than wipe out your livestock, but the heart of the Pharaoh was hardened and he did not let the people go. And then we get into the sixth plague, which is boils. And this one's interesting because he brings Moses in a bit more than he already has on this one. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls. Oh, it's Moses and Aaron. Oh, no. We'll see. Take handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils, breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. But then it says, so they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils. So it sounds like Moses and Aaron are working together, but it is It is Moses who seems to be the main guy. And it's quite a change from Moses not too long ago, where he seemed like he didn't feel like he was worthy for this calling. He said, send somebody else, I can't speak. Like he didn't seem like he was up to the task. Maybe he still had some guilt left over because he murdered someone. But now God is involving him, and he's maybe building him up into the leader that Moses ends up being. And he's already stepping into that role. Then we have hail. And for this one, I think the interesting line here is God explains why he's doing this even a little bit more. He says, this is verse 16. We're still in Exodus 9. It says, but for this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. Behold, around this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as never has been seen in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. So, once again, calling a shot, saying exactly when it's going to happen. But more interestingly here, he's saying why he's doing this. He's saying, I raised you up to be the most powerful nation in the history of the world, so that when I crush you, it not only proves that I'm real, but that I am the only God that has control over everything. And with every plague, there's just a clear stamp that it is God who is doing this. The separation from Israel, the fact that he's saying exactly when it's going to happen. And then on this one, he even gives them a chance for those who fear the Lord. He says, now therefore get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. Then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses, but whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. So there we have the idea that there's some people, even outside of the Hebrews, this is now talking about some of the servants of Pharaoh, are starting to get the picture. They're starting to see like, oh, this God is in control. He's warning us about what's going to happen. This is the 7th one, so we've already seen everything he's done in the past. Let's listen to him. And the ones that listen save their livestock and their servants, and the ones that don't, well, they lose them. And then once again, Lord is involving Moses in this. He says, stretch out your hand toward heaven, so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt on man and beast. And then, what do you know? It ends up happening. And all the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, was there no hail. So once again, with this one, we have the designation and the separation of the peoples. Egypt is struck by the hail. The Hebrews come away without being destroyed by the hail. And then once again, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And on a lot of these, I think almost all the last 3 or 4, the Pharaoh will often say, okay, I'm going to let them go this time. And then his heart's hardened and he goes back on his word. And in the 8th plague, this one's the locusts. I think what's interesting on this one is this is where the Pharaoh's servants are starting to pick up on what's going on even more. It says, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go that they may serve their God. Do you not understand that Egypt is ruined? So Egypt goes from being the most powerful nation in the world to being overrun by bloody water, by frogs, by gnats, by flies, by hail, now by locusts, boils on their skin. Just it says it perfectly. Egypt is ruined. And that's only the eighth plague. So he still hasn't gotten the picture. The eighth plague ends with, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. Again, it can be a little bit confusing that it's saying, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Is the Lord acting against Pharaoh's will and making him be ridiculously stubborn to the point that his kingdom is now ruined, just so he could prove a point against the Lord? How this was explained to me is that it's less God acting on the Pharaoh and more God actually just stepping back and letting Pharaoh be as evil as he would be if the Lord wasn't restraining him at all. He's in a position of complete power and he thinks he is acting on behalf of the gods. So God says, you know what? Let's see what is the fruit of your prideful heart. If I'm not there to hold you back at all, I know how hard it is going to be. And it's now going to be very hard for your people to the point where they're saying, come on, man, I get the picture. This is not working out well for us. And yeah, I think that one's enough for that one. We'll go into the ninth plague. This is, I think there was some verse in there that was kind of interesting, but I forget what it was. So ninth plague is now darkness on the land. So then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the people of Israel had light where they lived. So this is once again showing that God is more powerful than the Egyptian gods. I believe it's Ra, who is the Egyptian sun god. And this is like the last hope for the Egyptians. They think, okay, he might be stronger than the fertility frog god or the water god, but the sun god, that's our guy. And God says, yeah, darkness for you guys, light for the Hebrews, just to show how in control I am. And then at this point, Pharaoh says, so the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart again, as he would not let them go. And the Pharaoh said to him, get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. Moses said, as you say, I will not see your face again. So that's the ninth plague, but as we know, there are 10 plagues. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the reading tomorrow. Oh, I think I remembered what the verse was that I wanted to put forward or talk about. I can't find it, but in one of these plagues, Pharaoh does say, okay, you guys can go out into the wilderness, serve your God, worship him, do whatever you need to do. However, you have to leave your livestock behind. And I forget where that was, but I just thought that was interesting that maybe part of Pharaoh is thinking, okay, maybe let's give these people what they want. But there's still a part of him that wants to feel like he's in control, that feels like he's in a position to negotiate with God, to stand on his ground and try to, it seems like, save little face, have his ego that, oh, I'm going to make demands on, they can go worship him, but they have to do this in my way. And I love God's response. He says, no, that's not going to happen. You're showing that your heart's still hard, and that's not good enough. There's also parts where the Pharaoh will say, this time I have sinned, but he's ignoring all the other times that he's sinned. So it's like a fake concession, just like it's a fake concession when he says, oh, you can worship, but here's my stipulations for it. And it just seems like he's not humble. And that seems to be what God is trying to create in him, is humility. He's also just trying to show that he is God over all the land, and that it's going to be pretty clear when he brings the Hebrews out and when Egypt is ruined. So, what are some lessons we can pull from that? Humility, the fact that God is in complete control, that's no matter how powerful you think you are, you're not more powerful than the Pharaoh of Egypt. And God is just like a person with a laser pointer with a cat, just in complete control of the situation. And the Pharaoh is trying to pretend that he is somehow comparable to God, but because he is not humble, he's just making it more hard on himself and on his entire kingdom. Harder than it needs to be. But this is all part of God's purpose and how he shows that he's in control. One other thing that I think is kind of interesting here is I'm hesitant to sometimes read too much into scripture that's outside of what it actually seems like it's literally saying. But it could be some sort of metaphor here as well for the idea that God is the one that brings us out of slavery. God is the one who's in control of everything that goes on, whether it seems very bad or whether things seem to be working in our favor. God's the one that brings us out of slavery. And before we come to Christ, we are slaves to sin. We think that we have willpower and self-reliance and all these buzzwords that are popular in our culture, and which I was living by for a solid decade. I was very into that whole individualism type mindset, and it's not right. It's not true. God's the one who's in complete control, even when we think we're in control, just like how the Pharaoh thinks he's in control, but he's not. And the longer we fight that, just like the Pharaoh, the harder things will continue to be for us. And just like the plagues, it seems like they get worse and worse and worse. That's at least how my experience was as well. Things had to get worse and worse, and I had to get worn down more and more and more to the point where I was finally brought to the point where I said, okay, I give up. I'm not the one in control. And it's interesting that it's God who brings us to him. It's not us going towards him. We're trying to pull away in our sinful nature and our flesh. We're trying to hide from God as much as we can. And you might wonder why. Why is that the case? And I listened to a great video from R.C. Sproul today called The Trauma of Holiness, where he's talking about when Isaiah first sees God. And Isaiah would have been a very righteous man. But when he is in the presence of God, he is so overwhelmed by God's holiness and that contrast that he feels that he says, "Woe to me, I am undone." Some translations say, "I am ruined." And it's very similar to the story of Egypt here. Like they're being ruined. Maybe not a perfect parallel, but I just recognize those two words were the same. But it's this idea that the reason we hide from God is because he is holy and we aren't. And it was ultimately me getting a glimpse of God's holiness and God's love that put me in perspective and completely humbled me to the point where it was the hardest I've ever cried in my entire life, when I just got a glimpse of what God is like, because I realized how good he is. And I've got it was like I got a glimpse of God and also had a glimpse of myself, my true self, for the first time in my entire life. And next to God's holiness, I realized how ridiculous I was to think I could rely on myself and that I could compete or be on any kind of playing field with God. Just like the Pharaoh, give up, let go, know that God's the one that's in control. So, interested to continue to read into the last plague. We'll see what happens there. But now let's get into the Psalm for today. Psalm 17, 8 through 15. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings, from the wicked who oppress me, from my deadly enemies who surround me. So we go from this idea of wanting to hide from God to, once you realize that God is actually on your side, that he loves you and he cares for you and he wants what's best for you, and he knows what's best for you. He might be training you to become more like Christ and bring more fruits of the Spirit and burn off all the bad parts of you. We go from wanting to hide from God and run away from God to when we're acting correctly, we want to be with God as much as possible. To the point where we say, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me under the shadow of your wings. So we go from hiding from God to feeling hidden with God, that we're protected by God. And yeah, I think I'll leave the psalm there. I think that's a good message right there. Proverbs 5:21-23. For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. He shall die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. That first part, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord. That's where God sees everything that we do. He knows our thoughts. He knows our feelings. He knows what's in our heart. That's why there's no point in trying to hide from him, because he knows. And he ponders all his paths. And then the end here, it says, he has caught in the cords of his sin. He shall die for lack of instruction. And in the greatness of his folly, he shall go astray. So that's the idea that if you're stuck in that self-reliance mindset, thinking that you can do it all yourself, and even after you surrender your life to Christ, there's always that temptation to go back to trying to control the situation yourself, just like the Pharaoh seems to be doing, trying to stipulate what kind of worshiping they can do, trying to pretend that he's still in control. He's not. We're not. God's in control. I should remind myself of that every single day, because that seems to be one of the ways that I go astray. And that's literally what it says. And in the greatness of his folly, he shall go astray. So when we think we're in control, when we're not listening to God's instruction, that's when we go astray. And that's when things usually get harder, to the point where sometimes it has to get harder and harder and harder. That weight becomes heavier and heavier as we try to carry it ourselves, to the point where, we're reminded, this is way too difficult. I can't do this on my own. And then we surrender back to God again. We feel close to him. And then inevitably, we start to go astray again. But what I'm hoping is that as I grow in my Christian journey, I'll have longer periods where I feel like I'm with God, and shorter periods where I feel like I'm going astray. And maybe a heightened sensitivity to when I go astray, so that I turn back faster. Because there's still days at a time where I'll still be reading my Bible, but I won't really be into it. And then I'll be trying to control things on my own. I'll be thinking about the future. I'll be trying to control things. And yeah, I would like to have less of that time and more time actually feeling like I'm in the presence of God and with God. And one thing that I've noticed or I didn't really notice this was pointed out to me by my buddy Mikey. And when he said it, I thought, wait, that actually does show some of my improvement over this last year. And it shows why it is so great to spend time in God's Word. It's because I had a bit of a hard day where I felt like my heart was just in such a bad place. My feelings were in a bad place. My thoughts were in a bad place. It was just one of those days where bad thoughts just kept popping up. That fear of the future, anxiety about what might happen, just not good thoughts. And I knew that they weren't good thoughts, but they kept popping up. And I was just getting frustrated, because I was thinking, how long is this going to go on for? And I ended up being a little bit frustrated with myself, because I thought I'd come further from that, and that shouldn't, some of those thoughts shouldn't have been stuff that I was still worried about. Would have thought that I'd grown past that. But one of the things that Mike pointed out is that because I've been spending so much time in the Word, I recognized that those weren't good thoughts. Whereas me in the past, those thoughts would have popped up, and I just would have ran away with them. I wouldn't have second guessed them at all, because I wouldn't have known they were really bad. I would have thought, these are my feelings. That means they're true. And that means I should feel them, and I should think about them. and go for them. But because I spent so much time in the Word, not nearly as much as I could have, but a decent amount of time, thoughts pop up, and I'd, as it said, take them captive to Christ. Where instead of those thoughts taking over, I was able to defend against them by comparing them to Scripture. Where I'd realize, you know what, in this one, it seems to be I'm focusing a lot on what I don't have instead of being grateful for what I do have and what God's given me. And then in this one, it seems like I'm kind of putting this up as an idol. And I know that God should be the one who motivates me and where my focus is. And my focus certainly isn't on Him. So that thought doesn't seem like something I should really dive into because it's not a good thought. Basic idea there. Probably spent too long trying to explain that. But the basic idea is that the more time you spend in the Word, the more you learn about God, the more you learn what good thoughts are. So then you can see that comparison when bad thoughts come up, and then you can take every thought captive to obey Christ. And it actually works. And it worked in a way that I didn't even realize it was working until afterwards. And I thought, wait a second, I did kind of get out of that, because even though those thoughts kept popping up, I recognized that they were bad so many times in a row that I finally realized I need to just turn back to God and ask for help. And He helped immediately, as He tends to do. But now let's get into Matthew, because this is, I think, one of the more confusing, or you could say controversial stories. It's maybe not as confusing to me now, but the first time I read it, I thought, I don't like that story. I'm not into this one. And it is the laborers in the vineyard. This is Matthew 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So, master of the house has a harvest in his vineyard. So he goes out, he hires some laborers. They say, oh, it's going to be a denarius a day. I think that's pretty standard wage for a day's work. And they go out in the field. But then, and going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right, I will give you. So they went. So he doesn't even really agree with these people what they're going to get paid. He just says, I'll pay you what's right. And it's now 3 hours later in the day when these people start working. So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, or we'll just pause right there. So the 11th hour, that means the people who went out in the morning have already been working for 11 hours at this point. And I looked up 11th hour, and it says it's around 5 p.m. So it's basically the end of the workday. And that's when this last wave of workers goes out. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. So that's the point in the story where I was thinking, I'm on the laborer's side who've been working since this morning. They've been working all day long, and they get paid the same amount as the people who worked an hour. That's not fair at all. What kind of rule does that put forward? If that's the case, hire me at 11th hour. So, and we'll see why that's maybe not the way to think. And he actually explains why that's not the way to think. It says, they say, I've borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last. And I'll admit, when I first read this, I thought, that doesn't satisfy me. But that's because I didn't, and maybe still don't have the best grasp on the fact that the way God's kingdom works is almost like a flip upside down of how things seem to work in this world. In this world, we think if you work 12 hours, you should get paid more than if you work 1 hour. And that makes a lot of sense. But what this parable is teaching us about is salvation. And if there's anything that you pull from this parable, it's that the work that they did wasn't in proportion to the reward that they got. Really, what led to that reward was them being called into the vineyard. So it's the master of the house who goes out, calls them, and if the master of the house decides to call them, then they get that denarius, that reward. Whether they work 12 hours or whether they work 1 hour, the work doesn't matter. Now, this gets a little complex, so let's see if I can piece it all together. How this relates to us is because it's God who calls us, and when he calls us, we get salvation. And for my buddy Mikey, who's been a Christian for a long time, he's going to seminary, he's done some preaching, he's discipled all sorts of different people. We get the same salvation. He doesn't get more of an entrance into heaven than I do. I was saved last year. I'm still very new to the Bible. Some of the stuff I'm still reading for the first time. Some stuff is still making sense to me for the first time. Some stuff still doesn't make sense to me. But both my friend Mikey and I have the same salvation. And it's because while he's done a lot more work and he's spent a lot more time in the Bible, it's not our work that leads to that salvation. It's God calling us. And then we might think, okay, why does he call us? Is it because he knows what kind of work we're going to do in the future? No. You think about Esau and I believe it's Jacob. He decides Jacob's going to be the higher before they're even born because that's just the way that God put it forward. And it reminds me of a verse that God says, I think to Moses, he says, I will have mercy upon who I'll have mercy, and I'll have compassion on who I'll have compassion. It's God who decides who he's going to give this salvation to, who he's going to provide this mercy to. And he calls us, and then that salvation is ours, not because of any work, whether that's 12 hours or 1 hour, but simply because of God's mercy, God's love. And it's a gift given to us. And then you might say, okay, so should we just be that worker in the 11th hour? That's where I'd say no. Because, and this is also where it gets a little bit confusing, is there's plenty of other verses that say our rewards in heaven, once we get there, will be in proportion to the works that we do. So what gets us in is our faith. And we're saved by our faith and by grace alone. It's not our own doing, but it is the gift of God. But once we're in heaven, that's where, my buddy Mikey's been stacking up more treasures in heaven than I have. He's been doing that for a long time. I'm trying to catch up there. But right there, what I just said is the wrong way to think. That trying to catch up, comparing myself to them. Oh, does he have more rewards in heaven than I do? Oh, I need to start doing good deeds so that I get more rewards. That's going back to the way that we would think just in this world. I'm going to work harder so that I get more rewards. This parable is telling us that that's not the way that God works, and we want to be like God. So we want to think and act in a way that is in alignment with God. So in this parable, God is calling people and giving them a gift out of love and mercy. So even if we do know that we get more rewards in heaven, if we do more work in this life, if we sacrifice for God more. The ironic part is that you only get those rewards in heaven if the good things you're doing are actually for God, if they're done with a good heart. So if you're doing those good works just to get those rewards, you're not going to get them because you're doing them for yourself. And that gets a little complicated there. But the next question might be, okay, so then why do we do good works? Well, why did God give us the gift of salvation? Because he loves us. So we want to do good works for people because we love them. That's the 2 commandments Jesus said. Love the Lord, love your neighbor. And it's also not out of a selfish desire for more rewards in heaven, but it's out of gratitude for the gift that God has already given us. We got a gift that we didn't deserve. So we should then want to give gifts that maybe other people don't deserve. We want to, we just want to serve people as well as we can because we're taken care of at this point. As I was thinking about this today, where I was still somewhat stressed out and a little frustrated and feeling like I needed to rush. And I just thought to myself, I thought, why am I so rushed right now? Why am I so stressed right now? I know that God is with me. God has already promised me salvation, eternal life, endless joy, being sinless for eternity with him. And I know that that's waiting for me. And there's nothing else I need to do for the rest of my life in order for that to happen, because there was nothing that I had to do in the first place in order for that to happen. There was a gift from God and preservation of the saints. Once you're called, once you're saved, you're saved. So then you might think, okay, so then can I just do whatever I want for the rest of my life? No, because if you actually understand that idea, which I still don't maybe fully understand it, but once you really do understand it, then you don't want to take advantage of God's mercy. You're filled with God's love, and then you want to pour that on other people. You're grateful for that gift that you've been given, so you want other people to get that gift as well. So that's where you start reading as much of the Bible so that your own heart can be purified, so that you can be a light unto the world, so that you can be a good example to others, so that people who are lost, like you used to be lost, can see you and the fact that you seem to know where to go now. You're on stable ground for the first time ever, and you can show that stable ground to other people so that they can be led to God, and then God can save them as well. And it's not like the people who worked 12 hours got less because the people who worked 1 hour got the same. They agreed to a denarius, and that's what they got. Those people didn't even agree to anything, and they got a denarius. They're grateful. So the people who came last seem to be first because they're just filled with gratitude because they got more than they were expecting. But it's the people who worked all day who are then comparing themselves. They were the first to work, but then they feel like they're last because instead of being grateful, they're actually now in a place of entitlement and thinking that God owes them something. And I read something great in R.C. Sproul's commentary today. He says, if you tried to write a list of all of the things that God owes you, it would be a very short list. The only thing God owes us is the wrath that we deserve for our sin. That's it. And for some people, that is what they get. They get justice. And for some people, they get mercy. And for the people who get mercy, that's not because of anything they've done. That's not because of any of their works. It's because God chose to call them into his vineyard. And he did call us to do some work. But it's through his mercy, and it's purely a gift that leads to our salvation. So I think we should have a deep gratitude for that and then extend that generosity to others.